Welcome back to Japanese religion. In this video, we're going to talk about the connection between traditional Japanese religion and the fine arts. So what's the reason for the connection between religion and the arts? Well, this is a general human phenomenon that a lot of the fine art that gets produced, especially in traditional societies, is for religious purposes. Religions are very important in the culture, and you have a lot of elite donors who are, building temples or churches, who are funding the creation of icons or scriptures being copied, etc. That happens especially in Japan because the ruling class, especially surrounding the court of the emperor and the noble clans, were early patrons of religion and the arts together. So they were borrowing models from China in terms of the scriptures, the religions, the styles of art and architecture, and importing them to Japan. And so the kind of customs of the court became a real model, and they associated religion with the culture they were importing. So that was why Buddhism and then Confucianism and Taoism were connected with the rulers. But also the emperor was intrinsically connected to Shinto. So that was a strong reason for the emperor to support not only Shinto, but also a lot of the art supported by the emperor and the nobles were religious in nature. So the first two works of literature sponsored had Shinto myths, for example. And this custom of the ruling classes supporting the fine arts was continued by the samurai after they got power, in part to emulate the cultural prestige of the emperor and the nobles. The samurai too were patrons of the fine arts. And another way that the arts and religion became intertwined was that there would be these elite families, such as noble or samurai families, and they would sometimes donate their estates to Buddhist temples. And so if you look at the example on the right, Byodo Inn, this was originally an estate of the Minamoto clan, and it became a Buddhist temple, but the estate was designed, very artistically. So they had landscape gardeners, architects, creating things very carefully. And so that whole aesthetic, the artistic practices of the ruling class were easily transferred over to Buddhism. And this also worked with the abbots of the temple. The leaders of the monks there would often be from educated backgrounds, and so they would already have an interest in the fine arts because of their participation in the elite culture. And then even a further factor was that, especially after Zen came to Japan, that was a further infusion of Chinese cultural influence. So in addition to studying the Sutra of Huineng, the koan collections from China, the transmission of the Dharma lamp writings from China, they also studied Confucian texts. And so you get literature and the fine arts, calligraphy, poetry really practiced in the monasteries and temples as well. There was even a kind of philosophical connection, if you will, between Zen and the fine arts. So many people regarded the discipline necessary for meditation as being similar to training yourself very rigorously to master a fine art. And this was something put into practice by a lot of Zen masters even to this day. They will learn a fine art that they try to hone and perfect as they perfect their meditation practice. And each one is regarded as complementing the other. It's like a kind of spiritual cross-training, if you will. There's also a kind of connection between the spontaneity, creativity required for an artistic insight or intuition, and that you tend to receive through a moment of awakening in meditation. And so this idea is partly probably influenced by the Taoists' influence on Chan Buddhism, where you have this idea of natural spontaneity as something that's uncovered or revealed through meditation, and that can be reflected in artistic insights and creativity as well as spiritual insights. So one example of the connection between religion and the fine arts is No, which is a type of Japanese theater. Specifically, there are dramatic plays that incorporate both dance and music. And in part, the forms of the dances were influenced by Shinto Kagura and also by these ceremonial rice planting dances called dengaku that would be performed by villagers in the countryside. But they were uh, rituals, basically trying to honor the spirits who protected the fields to have them have a good harvest. And not all of the No plays, in terms of their stories and content, are religious, but some of them are. So No plays are all classified according to traditional subjects and themes. The traditional subject called Mugen No is about God, spirits, and other worlds. So these are kind of like mythic, otherworldly stories. The other ones are either historical or a mix of historical and supernatural. And there's also some of the five themes of No plays that are religious or supernatural in character. So the most obvious is the Kami Mono, where the theme is a myth about a shrine or kami. And it's common to have these performed at Shinto shrines. There's also Shura Mono, where the theme is the ghost of a samurai appears before a Buddhist monk and asks for salvation. The ghost is usually tormented by the killing and misdeeds he did in his former life. So there's a strong Buddhist theme there. And then there's also Oni Mono. Oni means demon or ogre in Japanese. So this is the story of a demon or monster. So it's kind of connected to the mythology or folklore that surrounds Shinto. Another fine art connected with religion in Japan is landscape gardening. So this started as a fine art when Japanese architects and designers were copying the Chinese formal gardens and creating them in Japan during the Nara period and after. And these especially entered into Buddhism when some Buddhist temples were actually the estates of nobles, as I previously mentioned. But it kind of took on a life of its own, so it just became a common thing to have really elaborate formal gardens in Buddhist temples, which could be used, for reflection and meditation. In the early period, the Chinese-style formal gardens, similar to those of Tang and Song dynasties, were created in Japan, but later on they kind of evolved their own highly naturalistic style. You can see an example of that here with Saihoji in Kyoto. This is actually a garden. It may look just like a natural scene, but all of this is carefully planned and tended. It's also called the moss garden. And so the idea here, the aesthetic here, is to imitate nature. And that may have been influenced by the Taoist idea of spontaneity as something that an enlightened person, natural spontaneity, you can follow the course of nature exactly as it is when you remove your kind of false artificial human layers of desire and greed and pride and things like that, then you find this natural harmony. So there may be a kind of influence there behind the scenes. So one type of landscape gardening is Karesansui, which means dry garden. So these are gardens made with sand and rocks. They're often found in temples. This developed out of a practice of having sand or gravel placed around a Shinto shrine or a Buddhist temple, and some of them just became more elaborate. So you can see the sand or gravel forms the basis of it, but then large rocks that are very evocative of islands or mountains are placed in them as well, or bridges. So oftentimes if there's a tall vertical mount of rock, this is representing Mount Horai. Mount Horai or Horai-san is the Japanese name for Penglai, which in Chinese religion is the Eastern paradise where the eight immortals and other immortal beings dwell. So it's kind of like a land of peace, harmony, and eternal life. It's like a Taoist paradise. Mount Meru is another thing the larger rocks can symbolize, which is the center of the cosmos in Buddhist cosmological theory. And this is a depiction on the right of Horai-san at Daitoku-ji. Ikebana is the art of flower arranging, and this developed out of elaborate flower offerings that were given to Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in Buddhism. It may have also been influenced by the use of plants in Shinto ceremonies. It did develop into its own fine art to a certain extent independent of Buddhism, so not all of the Ikebana are given as offerings to Buddhas. However, it's interesting because Ikebana plays a role as well in the tea ceremony, which was heavily patronized by Zen masters. So calligraphy is writing as a fine art, and this really entered Japan with the first introduction of the Chinese style of writing during the Tang Dynasty in China. And soon there was a knowledge that the style of writing could be a kind of art form in itself. And so the Chinese models were originally ones that the Japanese emulated, but then they developed their own styles. You can see a piece by Muso Soseki on the right, which is in this very loose, open, free-flowing, expressionistic style. He was a Zen monk and a very famous calligrapher, and it shows you that connection between the Zen monks, especially the masters, the ones who were great teachers, and the fine arts. They tended to see this connection between their religious vocation and their artistic vocations. And as well, a lot of the early calligraphy were copies of sutras or Buddhist poems, or with copies of Confucian texts. So there was this real close connection between calligraphy and Buddhism, because a lot of the Confucian learning or education was actually happening in Buddhist temples in Japan. And so there's a belief that the calligraphy can sort of express a scholar's essence or wisdom. They're important in Zen Buddhism because the idea is that the wisdom of a Zen master can be communicated through their writing. Chanoyu is the tea ceremony. So this is preparing and drinking tea or cha as a fine art or ceremony. And this was created by Zen masters. The Zen monks were the first to bring the custom of tea drinking to Japan from China. But there eventually developed a whole culture around tea. And because the Zen masters and their wealthy noble and samurai patrons were also patrons of the fine arts, these kind of became intertwined. So the tea bowls and other implements that you use in drinking tea became very elaborate and well crafted. Some of them look very rustic, but it's all very deliberate. There's a certain aesthetic that they're going for. There's also other fine arts that get incorporated into the tea ceremony. So the scroll with calligraphy is often on a Buddhist theme. You can see that on the wall in the picture on the right. There's a flower offering typically placed beside the scroll, and these will be placed in a tokonoma or an alcove for the tea ceremony. So there's often a special place or a room or even a hut where the tea is prepared and drunk. And also the way that the tea is prepared and the way it is drunk is all very stylized and careful and ceremonial. So the whole thing becomes a kind of like experiential or process that is itself an artistic expression. And finally, there's a connection with religion and popular culture. So there's definitely been a decline of religiosity in Japan, especially since the Second World War. So in the last 60 years, especially, fewer Japanese participate either in Buddhism or in Shinto. However, it still plays a big role in the popular culture. In addition to people having a common custom of going to shrines for certain benefits or for having Shinto weddings and Buddhist funerals, you can see the beliefs in popular culture. So manga or comics, anime, animated films, other movies, video games, many of them have plots and characters influenced by Shinto and Buddhism. So an example from anime is Spirited Away, which you can interpret as kind of like the plot is about a journey to this world in which the kami dwell. There's also the film, The Great Yokai War. Yokai is a kind of monstrous spirit. you can see a still production photo on the right from the film and all the different types of kami pictured. For example, the one in the front left is a kappa. So this is one of the river spirits. And there's also video games that do this. Like the main example is Okami, which is just named gods. And there are other examples too of kind of like the kami or Japanese beliefs about mantras and magic and so on, and folklore appearing in these various artistic media.